The mirror was still on the wall. That was the first thing Benedetto Foscari noticed when he pushed open the door of the warehouse on the Riva degli Schiavoni and found Chiara Morosini lying on the stone floor between the counting table and the window that looked out over the lagoon. Not the body, not the smell, though the smell was already there, thick and wrong, the kind of smell that settles into a room around something that has been dying for hours. The first thing he noticed was the mirror, her mirror, the one she had imported from Murano 3 years ago at a cost that had made her partners wince and that she had paid without asking anyone's opinion. Heavy silver frame. Glass so clear it almost hurt to look at. Hanging in its usual place on the eastern wall, catching the grey morning light, showing him his own face surprised, pale in a room where the only other person was already beyond surprise. He stood in the doorway for a long time before he went in. He would think about that mirror for 23 years. Chiara Morosini was found dead on the morning of March 14th, 1347. She was 38 years old, one of the most successful spice merchants operating out of the Rialto market. She had built her trading network from a small inheritance and 20 years of relentless precision in a city that did not, as a rule, make room for women in its counting houses or its councils or its commercial contracts. She had made room for herself in the only way available to someone in her position, not by fighting what the city was, but by understanding it so completely that she could move through its architecture without triggering its reflexes. And on the morning of March 14th, 1347, she was dead on her own warehouse floor. And the city she had navigated so precisely would spend 23 years believing she had died of a fever. She had not died of a fever, but the truth of what happened in that warehouse in the spring of 1347 would not surface until a piece of parchment was found pressed behind a carved leaf in a silver frame hidden there by a woman who knew she might not survive the night, who wrote 4 words that took 16 years to reach the right hands. Before we get to those 4 words, you need to understand who Chiara Morosini was, not the merchant, not the name on the contracts or the figure the rivals described, always with that carefully neutral tone people use when they respect someone they wish they didn't have to. You need to understand the person, because this case, like every case, was not really about a crime. It was about what happens when one person builds something real and another person cannot tolerate standing next to it. You're watching The Scribe of Crimes. Subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming. Now, back to Venice. And back to the merchant who was never supposed to be found. Chiara was born in Venice in 1309. The only daughter of a minor spice factor named Marco Morosini, who had spent his life in the shadow of the great merchant families without ever fully entering their world. He was careful, competent, and entirely undistinguished. He died in 1331, leaving Chiara a small warehouse on the Riva degli Schiavoni, 2 active trading contracts in Alexandria, and enough silver to keep operating for 18 months if she was careful. She was considerably more than careful. By 26, she had renegotiated both Alexandria contracts and added a 3rd in Cyprus. By 30, she had a working arrangement with a Genoese trading house that gave her access to routes her Venetian competitors couldn't easily match. By 35, she had expanded into high-value spices, saffron, mastic, long pepper, at a moment when the Venetian market for these goods was growing faster than most of the men trading in them had anticipated. She had anticipated it. That was the thing people only admitted about Chiara Morosini. In retrospect, she was almost always 3 years ahead of where the market was going, and almost always right. She never married. This was noticed and commented upon with the frequency reserved for women who deviate from what a city has decided they are supposed to do. She acknowledged the comments with a politeness so complete it bordered on dismissal, and continued doing exactly what she had been doing. She kept a journal. Not of business, she had the account books for that. This was different, personal, written in a small concentrated hand that filled the margins as well as the lines, as though there were always more to say than space allowed. She had been keeping it since she was 19. The journal survived her. This would become important. In the autumn of 1344, Chiara had entered into a formal business partnership with a woman named Agnese Dandolo. Documented before a notary, the partnership covered 2 trading routes, Cyprus and Crete, that neither woman could manage as efficiently alone as together. Chiara brought the supplier relationships and the capital. Agnese brought the ships. Between them, in 2 years, they built one of the more profitable spice operations on the Rialto. From the outside, it looked like a model of practical collaboration. Most people, watching it in 1345 and 1346, would have said it was working exactly as intended. Most people were not Chiara Morosini. What she had been seeing since the late months of 1346 was something in the numbers that did not sit right. Patterns in Agnese's decisions, the timing of purchases, the routing of shipments, the management of the accounts she controlled, that, taken individually, could each be explained away, but that, taken together, formed a shape Chiara recognized. She had built her business by understanding shapes. She recognized this one. She was being stolen from. Not grossly. Not obviously. With a precision and patience that was, in its own way, impressive, the kind of theft designed to remain invisible to everyone who is not looking specifically for it. Small amounts redirected, margins quietly adjusted. A portion of the Cyprus profit routed through an intermediary account that was not part of the formal partnership structure, whose existence Chiara had only discovered because she had the habit, inherited from a near failure in 1332, of checking things twice. She had been checking twice for 3 weeks. She had not yet confronted Agnese. She was not a woman who spoke before she was certain, and she was not yet certain of the full extent. She was building the picture. She intended to complete it before she acted. On the evening of March 13th, 1347, she was working late in the warehouse on the Riva degli Schiavoni. The accounts spread across the counting table. The Murano mirror catching the lamplight on the eastern wall. Fiora had gone home. Taddeo had gone home. Chiara was alone with the numbers, and she was very close to the end. She did not finish. Benedetto Foscari was 29 years old when he found Chiara's body. He had been her factor for 4 years, the man who managed the logistics of the warehouse while she handled strategy and relationships. He was competent, loyal in the way of someone who knows he is paid fairly, and he had the quality, rare in factors, of being able to sense when something was wrong with a set of accounts without understanding exactly how. He had noticed, in the weeks before her death, that Chiara was working later than usual, and with a particular focused tension he associated with her discovery mode. He had not asked. It was not his place. He arrived at the warehouse at the 7th hour on the morning of March 14th, an hour late, because the morning fog over the lagoon had been unusually dense, and the boatman had refused to cross until it lifted. He pushed open the door and found Chiara on the floor. She was lying on her back, arms at her sides, eyes closed, nothing obviously violent, no blood, no sign of struggle. Nothing overturned except a small ink pot that had rolled from the edge of the counting table and left a thin dark line across the stone toward the eastern wall. The accounts were still spread across the table. The mirror was on the wall. The room smelled of something Benedetto could not quite name, a bitterness beneath the usual smell of spices and wood and salt. He felt for a pulse. There was none. She had been dead for several hours. He stood up slowly. He looked at the mirror for a moment, not knowing why. He went to find the authorities. The investigation was conducted by the Provveditori di Comune, two men named Alvise Contarini and Niccolò Gradenigo, both experienced, both thorough, both operating in a city that was already beginning to tremble at its edges. Word had been arriving from the eastern ports for weeks. Something was moving westward through the trade routes. Something wearing the face of a fever that did not behave like a fever. The Black Death would reach Venice officially in the summer of 1347. What came before it, the weeks of rumors, of the terrible ambiguity between ordinary illness and the thing everyone was afraid to name, was its own climate. A climate in which death, when it arrived, was already wearing a mask the city had pre-prepared for it. This was not a coincidence. This was the calculation. Contarini and Gradenigo examined the body. They examined the warehouse. They spoke to Benedetto, to Fiora, to Taddeo. Contarini identified, with some hesitation, a smell that matched something he had encountered in Crete, consistent, he told Gradenigo privately, with a compound derived from oleander, which in sufficient concentration caused cardiac arrest, presenting, without specific knowledge to look for it, as natural heart failure. He could not prove it. He noted it in his private memoranda and not in the official record. The city physician who examined Chiara was a man named Giacomo Venier, 61 years old, who had been receiving news from the eastern ports for 6 weeks and whose professional threshold for attributing sudden death to disease had shifted considerably toward the probable. He examined Chiara. He rendered a finding of fever with cardiac complications. He was not wrong that she had died of something internal. He was wrong about what it was. The inquiry closed in 4 days. Venice in March of 1347 had other things pressing against its attention. The living had priorities that the dead, however respectable, could not override. Agnese Dandolo was 43 years old when Chiara died. Tall, with the kind of physical composure Venice recognized as authority in women who had earned it through decades of public presence, the ability to occupy a room without explaining yourself, to meet anyone's gaze without offering anything in return. She had been widowed in 1338 when her husband, a shipping merchant, died of a chest condition his physicians had predicted and been unable to prevent. She had inherited his ships. She had kept them running. The partnership with Chiara had been her idea. She had proposed it in autumn of 1344, structured it to mutual advantage, and managed it with a professionalism that impressed even the people who had doubted whether two women could operate together without one eventually deferring. What Agnese had been doing within that success was a calculation she had made once in early 1346 and had continued making daily without reconsidering. The calculation was simple. Chiara managed the Cyprus contract alone, the supplier relationships alone, the strategic planning alone. The accounts Agnese controlled ran through the shipping operations. Chiara reviewed them quarterly. Quarterly was enough time to move money in ways that quarterly review wouldn't catch, provided the amounts were small enough to blend into normal variance and the routing indirect enough to require time and specific knowledge to unravel. She had been correct about the time. She had not been correct about the specific knowledge. When Benedetto found the body and the news reached Agnese by the 8th hour, she received it with the composed expression of a woman who has just been told her business partner has died unexpectedly. She expressed sorrow in the appropriate form. She asked the appropriate questions. She attended the funeral, which was small and fast, in the way that March 1347 funerals were fast. Nobody wanted to linger near the dead in those months. She appeared at the preliminary inquiry, answered questions with cooperative precision, and was dismissed within 2 hours as a grieving partner whose accounts were, as far as anyone had checked, in reasonable order. No one had checked the accounts the way Chiara had been checking them. The partnership was formally dissolved in April of 1347. Lorenzo Morosini, Chiara's nearest surviving relative, a fish merchant from the Giudecca, who had seen her perhaps 4 times in the preceding decade, received the personal effects. Agnese retained the ships and the routing contracts and the relationships Chiara had spent 20 years building, which passed to her through the partnership agreement as the surviving partner. She managed them with the quiet confidence of a woman who had calculated correctly that the thing she had been afraid of was no longer a danger. She was right for 23 years. Fiora had been Chiara's household servant for 11 years. She was a woman of practical disposition who had learned that certain things in an employer's house were not hers to touch. She had known about the journal, had dusted around it for years. When the estate was settled, the journal went into a box inventoried as one personal book, leather-bound, handwritten, contents unexamined, and placed in Lorenzo's care on the Giudecca. What Fiora had not told the inquiry was this. On the evening of March 13th, leaving the house on the Campo Santa Maria Formosa after her duties, she had seen a figure moving in the direction of the Riva degli Schiavoni. Nearly dark. The figure wore a dark cloak, not remarkable in a city that wore dark cloaks in March, but was carrying something small and rectangular in one hand, held carefully at a distance from the body, the way you hold something you don't want to spill or tip. She had recognized the walk. 2 years of business meetings and guild events had made it familiar. She said nothing. The inquiry had already concluded before she had fully processed what she had seen. By the time she understood what the figure had been carrying a small flask, she thought, turning it over in her mind. Venice was emptying, of people fleeing the pestilence. And Fiora was trying to find work and not die, and the thing she had seen seemed to belong to a world already unreachable. She moved to Mestre. She survived. She did not return to Venice until 1353. By then, 6 years had passed, and the carrying had become so habitual she sometimes forgot, for weeks at a time, that she was carrying anything. Taddeo had been 19 when Chiara died. He ran errands and carried messages and had the quality of not being seen, which meant he had seen a great deal. In the fortnight before Chiara's death, he had witnessed Agnese arriving at the warehouse at unusual hours on 3 separate occasions. Once in the early morning before Chiara had arrived herself, once in the late afternoon after Taddeo had been sent home, and once in the evening when he was returning from an errand and saw her entering the canal-side passage at the back of the building. All 3 times she had not acknowledged him. The timing matched no business meeting he was aware of, and the back passage was not the route Agnese normally used. He had mentioned this to no one because no one had asked him about Agnese Dandolo's movements. He left Venice in 1348 and did not return. In the spring of 1356, Lorenzo Morosini decided to clear out a room on the Giudecca that had been accumulating boxes and the general sediment of 9 years of inattention. He found, on a shelf behind a broken oil lamp, a leather-bound journal he had completely forgotten he owned. He was not a reading man, but he was not illiterate, and Chiara's hand was legible. He read the first page. He read the second. He read 10 pages before he understood that he was reading something that was not a personal record in the ordinary sense, but a running document in which a very intelligent woman had been recording, in precise and accumulating detail, the evidence of a financial theft conducted against her by her business partner. The last entry was dated March 12th, 1347, 2 days before the body was found. Lorenzo read the last entry 3 times. He understood numbers well enough. He understood that what Chiara had written in those final pages was a complete reconstruction of a theft. The amounts, the routing, the dates, the intermediary account, the identity of the person who had operated it, with a clarity that left very little room for alternative explanation. He sat with the journal for 2 days. He took it to Benedetto Foscari. Benedetto had returned to Venice in 1358, after a decade in Padua, following the plague that had taken 38 people from his immediate world. He was 40 now, and working again as a factor, and carrying a persistent unease he had been attributing to grief for years. It was more specific than grief. It was the unease of a man who had stood in a room and noticed a smell he could not name, and looked at a mirror and felt something he could never fully articulate. When Lorenzo arrived with the journal, Benedetto read it in one sitting. He did not speak for a long time when he finished. Then he said, "I knew something was wrong. I could smell it." They took the journal to the Provveditore di Comune, specifically to a man named Marco Falier, 45 years old, 6 months into his appointment, and importantly, a man with no prior relationship to Agnese Dandolo's commercial network. He read the journal twice. He opened a formal inquiry in June of 1356. The inquiry lasted 4 months. Falier retained Giovanni Moro, widely regarded as the most precise commercial examiner in Venice, a man who could look at a set of accounts and understand not just what they said, but what they were designed not to say. Moro worked through the partnership accounts for 6 weeks and confirmed, in the dry professional language of an assessor's document, everything Chiara had been building toward in the final pages of her journal. The amount was 432 ducats, moved over 2 years in carefully redirected increments, each one small enough to blend into normal variants, the whole visible only when reassembled in the specific way Chiara had reassembled it. Falier moved to question Agnese Dandolo in October of 1356. She appeared before the inquiry with the composed precision that had always characterized her public presence. She brought documentation. She had clearly anticipated this possibility, 9 years of anticipating it, and the preparation showed. She had explanations for every discrepancy Moro had identified. Alternative accounting frameworks that, taken in isolation, could render each redirect as a legitimate variance. She was very well prepared. The journal was not something she had been able to prepare for. When Falier placed it on the table and read aloud the March 12th entry, the last one, the one that named her, that described the account structure and the amounts with the precision of a woman who had spent weeks verifying before she wrote Agnese's composure, did not break. It simply stopped, like a clock whose mechanism has reached its limit. She looked at the journal. She looked at Falier. She said nothing for a very long time. Then she said, "I did not kill her." Falier had not yet asked about killing. He asked, "Kill her how?" The inquiry expanded. Giacomo Venier, the physician, now 70 and retired, was brought before Falier and presented with the full account. He sat for a long time re-examining a memory and finding it worse than he remembered. He said that had he known, in March of 1347, what the inquiry was now suggesting, he would have looked more carefully at certain things. He said the smell Contarini had noted, the one that matched something in Crete, was consistent with oil of oleander, which caused cardiac arrest presenting, without specific knowledge to look for it, as natural heart failure. He could not certify the cause of death differently after 23 years, but he said it with the voice of a man who had reconsidered. Fallier found Fiora in Mestre and asked her whether she had seen anything relevant to the events of March 1347. Fiora looked at him. She looked at the table. She looked back at him. She told him about the figure on the campo, the walk she had recognized, the object held at arm's length, small and rectangular, carried carefully, the direction toward the Riva degli Schiavoni, the approximate time between the 6th and 7th hour of the evening, consistent with the period after Taddeo had left and Chiara had still been working. She said, "I should have said something in 1347. Fallier asked why she hadn't. She said, "Because I was afraid, and because I thought no one would believe me, and because by the time I understood what I had seen, it was too late." Fallier found Taddeo in Padua. He was 32, working in the cloth trade, and had not been back to Venice in 8 years. He described the 3 evening visits, the unusual hours, the back canal passage. The last time later than he had previously recalled, later in fact than the 6th hour, when he had been returning from an errand and had seen Agnes entering the loading side of the building. Fallier now had 2 witnesses who placed Agnes in the vicinity of the warehouse on the evening of March 13th. He had the journal. He had the physician's reconsideration. He had the slip "I did not kill her" from a woman who had not yet been asked about killing. He did not have enough. The Provveditori di Comune reviewed the inquiry in February of 1357. Their finding was the most frustrating outcome of Fallier's professional career. Sufficient evidence to establish financial wrongdoing against Agnese Dandolo, for which a fine of 500 ducats was assessed and paid, but insufficient evidence to establish criminal responsibility for Chiara's death. The passage of time had rendered certainty impossible. Agnes paid the fine. She expressed neither guilt nor exoneration. She paid it with the composure of a woman who had calculated her risks over 9 years and concluded that the worst outcome she would face was financial. She had calculated correctly. Fallier spent 3 years after that carrying a dissatisfaction with no resolution available to it. He retired in 1360. He had done everything within the architecture of the process he served, and it had produced a fine. He did not know about the mirror. The Murano mirror had passed with the rest of the warehouse inventory into the estate Lorenzo Morosini administered. Lorenzo had sold most of the inventory. The mirror he had kept, for reasons he could not fully articulate, probably because it was the most beautiful object he had ever been in a room with. And selling it felt like a final erasure of a person he had not known well enough and had been given no further opportunity to know. It was in his house on the Giudecca, on the eastern wall of the front room. He had looked at it for 14 years. In 1362, Lorenzo's daughter, Caterina, 15 years old, grown up with the mirror on the wall. With the habit her uncle had also had of noticing things other people didn't, was polishing the silver frame. The tarnish on the carved border had been accumulating for years. She worked through it methodically, section by section, the way you clean something that has been waiting to be cleaned. In the lower right corner, behind the back of a carved acanthus leaf that curled around the edge, she found something pressed between the metal and the wall, small and flat, folded many times, held in place by the pressure of the frame and the years. She brought it to her father without unfolding it, because it was not hers to unfold. Lorenzo unfolded it. It was a fragment of parchment, Chiara's hand small, concentrated, unmistakable. Dated March 13th, 1347. It read, "If you are reading this, it is because I am no longer able to say it. A. Dandolo has been taking from our accounts since April of last year. The full accounting is in the journal. I have confronted her this evening. She knows I have the evidence. I do not know what she will do. If something happens to me, look in the journal. The journal is in the house. Look behind the account book on the shelf above the fireplace. I am afraid." The note was not signed. It did not need to be. Chiara had confronted Agnese on the evening of March 13th, told her directly what she had found and what she intended to do with it. And then, before the night was finished, she had pressed this note behind a carved leaf in the most distinctive object in her warehouse, the Murano mirror on the eastern wall, and gone back to the counting table to keep working. She had known. She had been afraid. She had done the only thing available to her. She had left a trail. Lorenzo took the note to Benedetto Foscari, who was 55 years old and had been waiting, without quite knowing for what, since the inadequate finding of 1,357. Benedetto took it to Marco Fallier, who had retired but had not stopped thinking about the case. Fallier read the note and was silent for a long time. Then he said, "She told her she knew, and the next morning she was dead." He brought the note before the Provveditori di Comune in the spring of 1363. The case was reopened. The new evidence, Chiara's own words, written the night she died, expressing fear of the specific person who had been questioned and fined 6 years before, shifted the weight of the accumulated record in a way the 1,357 inquiry had been unable to achieve. The inquiry summoned Agnese Dandolo. She appeared with the same composure she had brought to every prior examination and was confronted, across the same table, with a piece of parchment that had been pressed behind a carved acanthus leaf in a Murano mirror for 16 years. Agnese looked at the parchment. She looked at Fallier, who had come out of retirement to sit at this table for this session. She looked at the words in Chiara's handwriting. "I am afraid," she said. "I want to make a statement." What followed was not quite a confession in the legal sense. It was careful, loyally, constructed to minimize while acknowledging. She confirmed she had been at the warehouse on the evening of March 13th. She confirmed she had brought a preparation she had obtained through a third party. She did not name the third party and had administered it in the wine cup she found on the counting table. She said that Chiara had told her that afternoon she intended to bring the journal evidence before the Provveditori the following morning. Agnese had understood, in the space of a conversation lasting less than 20 minutes, that she had run out of time. She had administered the preparation. She had left. She had locked the warehouse door with her partner's key held for 2 years, never returned. She had walked home along the canal. She had spent the night, and the following morning, and the following 23 years, in the performance of a woman who had not been there. She said, "I did not think anyone would look carefully enough. It was 1,347. The city was dying. I calculated correctly," Fallier said, "until the mirror." Agnese said nothing. The Provveditori di Comune convicted Agnese Dandolo of the murder of Chiara Morosini in October of 1363, 16 years after the crime. 7 years after the first inquiry that came close and failed. 1 year after a 15-year-old girl, polishing a silver frame, found what a city had not thought to look for. Agnese was 60 years old. She was sentenced to exile removal from Venice and all its territories, permanent, with forfeiture of remaining assets. She left the city in November of 1363. She was reported in Ferrara in 1364, in Bologna in 1366. After that, nothing. She disappeared into a continent large enough to absorb a woman of 60, with no home and no name, and a calculation that had, after all, turned out to be wrong. Benedetto Foscari was 60 years old when the conviction was announced. He had spent 32 years carrying a smell he could not name and a mirror he could not stop seeing. He went to the Campo Santa Maria Formosa on the afternoon of the announcement and stood outside the house where Chiara had lived and kept her journal and pressed a note into a frame in the last night of her life because she was afraid, and the mirror was what she had. He stood there for a while. The Campo was quiet. The canal was audible somewhere behind him. He went home. Caterina, who had found the note and who was now 16, polished the rest of the mirror frame with the methodical attention of a girl who had understood, in the moment of finding, that objects kept things, and that keeping things was a form of waiting, and that waiting was a form of loyalty to the person the object had belonged to. She would keep the mirror for the rest of her life. There was one final piece. In the spring of 1377 years after the conviction, a priest named Fra Matteo received a confession in a hospice outside Padua from an elderly woman dying of a lung condition. She had asked for a confessor with a specific kind of urgency, not the urgency of the devout seeking peace, the urgency of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and needs to put it down before she dies. Fra Matteo was 38 years old. He had been a Dominican friar for 15 years. He heard confessions regularly. He was not easily unsettled. This one unsettled him. The woman told him she had worked before the plague in a household on the Rialto side of Venice, in the service of a woman whose name he would recognize. She did not give the name. She did not give her own name. She told him she had obtained, through procurement networks available to her in that household, a preparation that she had been asked to obtain. She had delivered it on the evening of March 13th, 1347, to an address on the Riva degli Schiavoni. She said, "I was not the woman who used it. I was the woman who obtained it. I knew from the morning of March 14th what the preparation had been for. I said nothing because I was afraid. I told myself she had been punished, first the fine, then the conviction. I tell you now because I am dying, and I cannot die with it." Fra Matteo gave her absolution. He left the hospice with the specific weight of a man who has heard something that changes nothing, material, and everything moral. He could not carry it to the courts of Venice. The seal of confession was absolute, and the case had been closed for 7 years. He sat in the Dominican chapel in Padua for 2 hours before he went to bed. 3 months later, he began writing a document he described as a meditation on the nature of complicity, on the difference between the person who acts and the person who enables the action, on whether a sin carried in silence for 23 years and released in a confessional constitutes, in the end, a form of justice or simply a form of dying. No names. No date specific enough to identify the events. Nothing that could be construed as a breach of the seal. A theological essay circulated among the Dominican houses. It reached Venice in 1372. Benedetto Foscari was 68 years old when someone gave him the essay. He read it in the afternoon, by the window of his house, with the winter light coming off the lagoon in the grey flat way it had in February. He read it twice. He set it down. He sat for a long time with the specific quality of a man who has just been handed the last piece of a picture 32 years after the picture began, in a form that names no names and proves nothing and matters completely. He did not need the names. He knew the names. He went to the window and looked at the lagoon, the same lagoon Chiara's warehouse had looked out on, the same gray water, the same boats, the same light that had been there in March of 1347 and would be there long after he was gone, and he stood there for a while. Then he sat down and he thought about the smell in the room and the ink pot on the floor and the mirror on the wall and the woman who had pressed a note behind a carved acanthus leaf because she was afraid and the mirror was what she had, and who had died before anyone could tell her that she had been right to leave it there. He thought about what a conviction is and is not. About the woman in the hospice outside Padua who had been an intermediary and who had died with the weight finally off her, and whether that was adequate, and whether anything in the end was adequate. He did not have answers to any of these questions. He had been not having answers for 32 years. He got up. He closed the window. He made himself something warm to drink. Chiara Morosini had been 38 years old when she died on the floor of her warehouse between the counting table and the window that looked out over the lagoon. She had built everything she owned from a small inheritance and a very specific kind of intelligence. She had understood in the last evening of her life that the person she trusted most in her commercial world had been stealing from her for 2 years. She had confronted her. She had been afraid. She had pressed a note behind a carved leaf in a mirror and written, "Look in the journal." Someone had looked in the journal. It had taken 9 years, and a fish merchant who was not a reading man, and a factor who remembered a smell, and a girl polishing a silver frame, and a priest who wrote a meditation he could not quite name, and 32 years of a city that had almost let it go. But someone had looked. The mirror was still on the wall. Before you go, this case left behind 8 people. And every choice they made determined how long the truth took to arrive and how much of it survived. Chiara, who discovered she was being robbed, confronted the thief and pressed a note into a mirror frame in the last night of her life, not enough to save herself, but enough to be heard eventually. Agnes, who stole with patience and killed with calculation, and performed 23 years of innocence so convincing that even the inquiry that came closest gave her a fine and let her go, undone in the end by a carved leaf and the one hiding place she had never thought to check. Benedetto, who smelled something wrong in a dead woman's warehouse and spent 32 years carrying that certainty with nothing to show for it, and who was right about all of it from the first hour. Fiora, who saw a figure on a campo in the dusk and said nothing for 9 years out of fear, and then said everything when finally asked, and whose single testimony placed the killer on the street. Taddeo, the invisible errand boy who saw things invisible people see and never forgot them, and who came back to Venice when the inquiry found him 20 years later, and gave his account without embellishment. Lorenzo, the fish merchant who kept the mirror because it was too beautiful to sell, and who found the journal on a shelf behind a broken oil lamp and had the good sense to take it to someone who could read it properly. Caterina, who was 15 years old and polishing a frame and found, behind a carved acanthus leaf, 16 years of a dead woman's fear, the most consequential act of cleaning in this entire story. And Fra Matteo, who heard the last confession of the last link in the chain and carried what he heard in the only form available to him, not quite silence and not quite speech, pressed into a meditation about complicity that a dying man in Venice read by a winter window, 32 years after the night it all began. 8 people, 1 warehouse, 1 mirror that held the light, 23 years. Here is the question. Chiara pressed a note into the frame of her mirror on the last night of her life, knowing she might not survive what was coming. She could have run. She could have gone directly to the authorities that evening, before returning to the warehouse. Instead, she stayed and confronted Agnes and left a trail. Was that courage, or a failure to believe she was truly in danger? And of all the silences in this story, Fiora's 9 years, Taddeo's 20, Fra Matteo's sealed confession, Agnes's 23 years of performance, which silence came closest to making the truth permanent? Leave your answer in the comments. I'll be reading every one.